So I'll be more like, this is going to be more like a story. I mean, may not follow the normal conventional presentation because I want, it's going to be semi formal kind of. So I'll be creating a narrative around quantitative research approach, basically from conceptualization to contribution. I mean, so the whole essence of research at doctoral level is that you make a tangible contribution to knowledge. So we're going to look at it from quantitative perspective. And so as I present, please feel free to stop me at any point, perhaps by raising your hands or by muting your microphone to ask questions. So this is going to be that flexible. And yeah, I'll be speaking to some of my experience in the quantitative research field. So now, quantitative research as a journey, just as I said earlier on, the idea is that every researcher want to move from asking pertinent research question into making um, good research contribution, appreciable research contribution. But most of the time, even in quantitative or qualitative, the route is not that straightforward, like the arrow that you're seeing. But looking at it from the quantitative perspective, the first thing that you need to do is to develop a conceptual model. I'm sure some of you might think, oh, where is the literature review here? So the idea is that your conceptual model actually sits on your literature review. So your conceptual model draws on your deep insight into the literature, into the theory, that speaks to that research domain, and particularly that's research questions that you're asking. Now, after that, you adopt data collection and analysis approach. So once you have your model most of the time will inform you, and that's why it's even important at the level of proposal that you have an idea of what that model might look like, even if you are not putting it together. So the second stage really is to adopt data collection, analysis, and approach. So how do I source for data? What are the variables that I could extract from the conceptual model? What are the constructs that speaks to this variable? How do I fetch that data? What are the kind of instrument that I need to create and all that? Then important thing again is you might be tempted to just think that you're the only one in that area, and then you could just pick up anything from anywhere, to use. But that is not, it's not so. Specifically at when you're researching at this level, you need to justify why you're doing what you're doing, and it has to be reasonable. It has to be clear, and most of the time it has to be perhaps repeatable. And after that, you go to the data collection itself, data collection and field work. And this is more um, interesting and I think a bit more difficult for quantitative research than you have in qualitative. Some of the reasons include the fact that in quantitative, you're looking at a bigger sample size, most of the time. And again, the type of model that you have might also imply that you have more like heterogeneous set of samples. So it means you might be speaking to different kind of people. Then again, most of the time you're going to make use of survey. So administering survey, getting people to fill your survey and all that is much more difficult than other qualitative data collection instruments, like you have interviews, perhaps you have focus group, or observation and all that. So you agree with me that it's more difficult. So it again means that you need to think through it and have a strategy for collecting data. And we're going to speak to that in a moment. And finally, you look at how you want to analyze this data. How am I going to analyze this data? This model, what quantitative analysis does it resolve into? What is the matching? Perhaps I'm going to use the word formula that is useful or usable in that particular scenario. And then how do I interpret data? How do I present data? And so these again, from your results, ability to reflect on your results and interpret it, that's what takes you to research contribution. So from this illustration, you agree that, moving from research question to research contribution, as simple as it sounds, and as straightforward as it looks, most of the time is not that straightforward. And I must also state here that this illustration is just trying to generalize the process. So the idea is it can actually be more than 5 steps, it could be 7 steps, it could be 10 steps. I mean, depends on the particular problem scenario or problem domain that you're looking at. So I need to provide that caveat. So it will look like, oh, Davo says we have 5 steps, in qualitative research journey. Okay, so moving on from there, I'm now going to take each of these steps one after the other, just to provide some form of insight. All right. But before then, I also need to mention that steps 2, 3, 4, 5 here, you could have scenario where you have to feedback, into each one of them. So the idea is when you adopt your data collection approach and you're trying to justify, while justifying, you might discover that something is wrong, then you have to go back to the adoption stage. While looking at data collection, you might see that something is wrong with your approach, or your analysis. So there might be some form of feedback loop in this area. So the idea, again, is you need to be clear about your sampling strategy, data collection strategy, and data analysis strategy within that bracket. Okay? So next is quantitative research question. And I think this is the foundation of everything, whether quantitative or qualitative. If you want to do research, you must be answering some questions. You must have some objective or some aim, which again should lead to specific, clear, answerable, researchable questions. So, but looking at it from quantitative perspective, you could actually group your research question into 3, and we've got the descriptive, the comparative, and the relationship-based research question. And I'm going to give an example. Now, descriptive research questions speak to how frequent, more like measurement, how frequent, what percentage, and this is different from qualitative, where you're free. Qualitative is more like, you're an artist, and so your worldview and everything around you, in a way, influence how you interpret, the research itself, and even your data collection, your analysis, and all that. So you have a lot of freedom, but that is not exactly the case in quantitative research because there are how do I put it now? There are boundaries, yes, that you need to work within certain defined, and one of those boundaries is the fact that you need to be clear. So your description is not just an open loop description. In quantitative study, your description has to be specific. So when you're saying descriptive, you need to say how frequent, what percentage, what relationship, and all that. And for example, you could want to ask the question, to what extent, I think that should be extent, do SMEs in UK use mobile apps for seizing opportunity? And in that, you identify variables. So what are the variables you have here? SMEs, mobile app. I think I repeated SMEs twice. Then mobile app usage, which again is you're looking at it from usage for seizing opportunities. So it's not just simply using mobile app for anything. How do they use it for seizing opportunity? And so you also might want to consider your demographics in terms of who we respond to your questions, who are the target audience. Okay, so here you're looking at SME entrepreneurs. So when you're talking about SME, SME, you cannot just ask questions from SME. Somebody must represent the SME. And in this situation, you have entrepreneurs, the owners of the SMEs, the managers, or even the employees of the SME within UK. So again, there is a boundary. And why I'm saying this is that when you ask your question, even if you don't have it written down, at the back of your mind, you should begin to process what are the variables in this question and what are the demographics, because that is going to help you to know whether you are making the right judgments from the beginning, such that you are not even going to go too far, to know that there is a problem. Okay. So in terms of comparative research questions, here there's a clear comparison between at least two variables. So you ask questions like, what difference exists between A and B? How compatible is A and B with C or something, And an example could be, how do micro businesses and small businesses in UK sense opportunities through mobile apps? So in this situation, you have made some kind of assumption that, the way micro businesses and small businesses in UK sense opportunities using mobile app perhaps will be different based on whatever factor. So the idea is you want to know if there are differences in that. And so the variables here will be micro businesses, small businesses, mobile app usage, again in the context of sensing opportunity. And then the demographics look similar to what we said before. In terms of the relationship-based question, here you are looking at the relationship. So here you are talking about influence, you are talking about impact. That's when you make that kind of that. So what's the relationship between A, how does X relate to Y and Z in certain situations? So an example could be what the relationship between the size of SME and the use of mobile app for sensing opportunities. So the idea is, does size play any role in the way small businesses sense opportunities with mobile app in UK? And then here, when you're looking at relationship-based question, it becomes obvious that you've got dependent variables and independent variables. So independent variables are variables that does not change. So the idea is, if you the function of the independent variable decides the outcome of dependent variables. So the size of SME in the context, you don't change, you don't vary the size of SME, but the size of SME perhaps determine how mobile app is going to be used. And so the demographics again is similar. So it's important that when you are framing your questions, your research question, you put these things at the back of your mind. And I must say that the why question don't usually sit very well with quantitative research. So when you're asking why do SMEs in UK use mobile app, for instance, it doesn't really sit well because it's not about measurement, and then it's a bit open-ended. So I kind of extracted that objectives of study, what you see here, from one of the papers I sent earlier on, which again is one of the quantitative studies I published a while ago. And so this speaks to the objective of the research, again, which should be transformed into some form of questions. And if you look at this, you see again that they fit perfectly well into these three segments of quantitative research question. So the objective of research was to determine how mobile app usage influences three dimensions of the learning capability. I don't want to read that. I believe we must have looked into that before. Just not to waste our time. Okay, so let me now move to the very first bit of that steps, which is developing conceptual model. Okay, I know we have an idea of what.
Sorry, before you move on to this one, I wanted to sort of ask just a brief question for the different types of, just to confirm, should your quantitative questions all incorporate the descriptive, comparative, relationship-based elements, or can you have, for a research question, can you have some that, those that just incorporate some of them for a quantitative study?
So you could actually have three of them together. So again, it depends on your model. So the idea is your model could most of the time will have more than one of these type of study questions. Okay, especially at doctoral level, So that's why I'm not going to be speaking to some quantitative analysis, the basic quantitative analysis, stuff like ANOVA, chi-square, chi-test, two-test and all that. Those ones are quite simple. You can't really, it's not, it won't make so much sense in when you're looking at it from doctoral perspective. So I'm not going to speak to that.
Okay, so
question?
So to confirm, your at PhD level, you're saying, or a very in-depth analysis should have all three of those elements within the questions.
Of those elements.
Oh, I see. Okay. I see. Thanks.
All right. Thank you. So in terms of conceptual model, so what is conceptual model or conceptual framework? So conceptual model is simply a written or visual representation of relationship between your variables. So you remember from where we started here that your question already has variables, okay? And so the conceptual framework is a way of visualizing that research question or that research objective, okay? But then it's not just about drawing what's it called, diagram or images from the sky, just drawing it from anywhere. Okay, there are procedures on how to do this, okay? But then before going into that procedure, the process, I would like us to consider how or why conceptual framework is quite important, okay? The first is that, and this list is not exhaustive, okay? It positions your study on existing theory, all right? So the idea is that you need to look for, having done extensive literature review, literature search, you must have deeper understanding of that problem domain and more understanding about what each of those variables that you are looking at, or perhaps entities that you're looking at, okay? And so you must have looked at existing theories, existing framework that speaks to that problem domain, or specifically speak to that variables or those entities within your problem area. So the idea is that you dwell, you allow that framework, you create that framework from existing theory. Again, it provides structure and clarity on the variables and how they relate. So by the time you have them sit on theory, and then you have identified those variables, and you can see how those variables relate and how they match up together. Again, it provides a framework for argument, okay? Doctoral dissertation is about pushing forward an argument, okay? So you have an argument, and that argument has to be clear. I mean, the start of defeat is when you don't have a clear argument. So you don't even have a basis, for arguing in the first instance, because the examiner asks you, so what basis? How do you justify it? So you don't have a framework, or you don't have a reasonable diagram that summarizes what the research is about. Your argument is very weak and slim just to even start off. Okay, and then it demonstrates high quality thinking. So when somebody looks at a framework or your conceptual framework, it gives an idea that so much thought, so much work, so much consideration have gone into that study. And so that is what differentiates it from a first degree, this is a dissertation now, or thesis, and dissertation or a study. Okay, so how do you create a conceptual framework or model? All right, I think I've said that before, but then perhaps I need to say it again, that you need to identify a synthesis theory that speaks to the research question, build arguments from your literature. And I think this is perhaps the best way of doing it. So the idea is you look at literature, and then you look at what literature says about that area. And then based on that, as you're reviewing literature, you are building your argument. This argument could be in form of hypothesis. Okay, so you begin to frame your hypothesis as you develop your literature. Okay, and then you now aggregate those variables in that hypothesis, and then you connect them in form of relationship. And I'm going to give an example. Okay, so this is an example. If you look at that paper, one of those papers that I sent to you, I think the one about structural equation modeling or so. Yeah. So I built this hypothesis from literature while I was looking at the literature that speaks to. So the first thing is I identified dynamic capability framework as a theoretical framework that is relevant, because dynamic capability speaks about how to sense opportunities, how to maximize opportunities in a fast changing business environment. Okay, so that aligns closely with what I wanted to do. Okay, but then in that, dynamic capability has 3 dimensions. So you have the dimension of the adaptive, the innovative, and the absorptive capabilities. Okay, so the idea is, based on that literature, then I begin to formulate those hypotheses. So for instance, I said that absorptive capability increases SME's opportunity sensing ability. So the idea is increases how SMEs will sense opportunity. So I kind of created them constructively like that, and it was really clear. And that is what how to draw or create your conceptual model. So you could create those hypotheses. So when you look at this, you find out that I've got about, 5 I grouped those hypotheses into 5, but then they are much more. I think they're about 15 or so, I can't remember. But then putting all these together, then I have something like a framework. So this diagram is a conceptual framework that interprets this literature, these hypotheses that I draw from literature. And you remember that, again, this hypothesis sits on the dynamic capability framework. So when you look at this conceptual framework here, already you can see dynamic capability framework in here. But the interesting bit of it is that it's like me adapting dynamic capability framework into my own research context, okay, into my specific research area. So it's like owning that situation, owning that problem area, just borrowing concepts all over the place. So it's very clear how I arrived here. Is clear, is reasonable, and I could explain this to anyone, and you could use this as a basis of argument. I mean, to be a framework for arguing. And so it demonstrates, without even telling anyone, some high level of quality thinking. Okay? So that's about developing conceptual model. There are other ways, but I think this seems to be the perhaps easiest and most acceptable way to do it. I mean, perhaps, I mean, from my own perspective, there are other ways you could do it, and you could be creative about it. Now, the second bit is adopting data collection and analysis approach. Okay, so the idea now is you move from your conceptual model into thinking, now that I have this model, how do I collect data, that will help me to make sense of this model? Okay, and then there are a few things that we need to ask again about this model. So quickly, let me just go back a bit. You remember we said something about descriptive, comparative, and relationship-based. Yeah. So when you look at this model, you'll find out that we have about all those questions here. Okay. Descriptive. I think it's only descriptive that is not here. So the relationship and the what's it called, the other bit is actually present here. Even the descriptive, at the end of the day, you'll see that it's here. And then again, you could say that this model is actually trying to test the applicability, or how applicable is an existing framework, okay, existing theory in a particular situation, okay, or to a particular situation. There are other models, okay, that could be exploratory in nature. So the idea is I don't even have an idea of what that environment looks like and how, what's it called, the variables will interact, okay? I only know that there are variables, but I don't know how they will interact. That is more about exploratory, and then we're going to get to that later. So, but I need for us to put this as somewhere at the back of our mind that your model at some point will determine already, begin to speak to how the kind of analysis, approach or strategy that you're going to use at the end of the day. So let's get back here now. So when you have this kind of model, the question now is, what are the variables that I have here, okay? And what constructs would represent these variables, okay? So, and that's what I already explained in terms of exploratory descriptive design and confirmatory experimental design. I don't want to go into that again. I already explained that this model will begin to show you whether what you're trying to do is confirm existing theory, or you want to create something from scratch, or explore, or you are trying to do some form of experiment. Usually when you are performing an experiment, there is supposed to be a control group. So it means that you need to have the experiment group now and the control group, so that you want to find a way of finding the difference, between those groups. And so in this situation, have been able to identify, and I'm just trying to use this as an example because I feel that the example is going to make more sense to you than just speaking grammar or jargons, because I know from my experience that it's a little bit more difficult to make sense of quantitative research than you do, for qualitative study. Okay, so here you found out that I've got a definition or explanation of each of these variables and their constructs. So you have the first one, mobile app. You have adaptive, innovative capabilities, and then I have to define what they mean. And you see that it's not just from my head. I've got some reference or footing in literature. And then here it speaks to the opportunity. So how does adaptive capability influence sensing, shaping, and seizing? How does adaptive, innovative influence? So you have them like that, and then you want to also see the mobile app. How does it influence these guys out of these, So at some point, you could even introduce another flavor to it and call another what's it called, variable here, and say the variable is influencing or moderating the effect of, relationship between 1 and 2. You are making it more complex. I agree, but that is the beauty of quantitative research. So I hope I've been able to make sense of this a bit. I know it's going to be getting a bit fuzzy, but just go with me, okay? So, leaving this, we move to the third stage, which is the need to justify. So now you have been able to identify those variables. Important thing is the construct, okay? And I think I need to speak to that. So the construct is I have identified absorptive capability, okay? But how do I now design my questionnaire or my instrument, in a way that captures absorptive capability? So for instance, the small business owner does not know what absorptive capability is. So it means that you need to be able to interpret that variable in a way that makes sense to, to your target audience, okay? And that is where the bit of the construct comes in. All right, so identifying what construct makes sense to them. In most cases, all right, the best approach is actually to do what we call mixed research approach, okay, where you will have done some form of qualitative study that extracts those constructs, okay? So you must have interacted with a smaller sample of the target population, and you are able to extract some of these constructs from them. So it makes it a lot easier. Another way is to look at literature and see if someone has done something similar to that before, and so has an example or a definition or a construct of what these variables look like. So you could borrow from that existing knowledge or existing work and use them to frame your study. All right? So the next is to justify your data collection and analysis approach. And in doing this, there are a lot of things that comes to mind, but key out of them is your sampling approach, identifying the population, the sampling technique, is it going to be random? How representative is it going to be? What kind of sampling approach are you going to use? Is it going to be probability sampling, non-probability? Is it clustered? Is it systematic? Is it stratified? Convenience, snowball, quota? So you want to think through it, and you need to be able to justify why you are doing some of this thing. For example, when we say justify, I found out that some people just think, oh, they've come again. How will they ask me to justify? Justifying is just asking, why are you doing what you're doing? Okay, so justification could be as simple as, that is the best approach to do it based on my experience in this area or based on my observation. That could be as simple as that. But then the idea is you don't just, select an approach because you feel like that is the best thing to do. There must be compelling reason why you're doing what you're doing. And we need to know, when I say we now, the body of knowledge needs to know why you're doing what you're doing. So the next is about the data collection instruments, okay? So converting that model, the variables, the construct and all that into a data collection instrument. And then for quantitative research, survey, questionnaire seems to be the most common, the common thing that we make use of. Okay, so but in doing that, in creating your instruments, you need to look at simplicities, effective communication. You need to look at the characteristics of the population, the people that you're going to be interacting with. Okay, so you need to be able to ensure that you design that instrument in a way that will make sense to them. And then you also must overcome the temptation of collecting the data that you don't need, because sometimes you just want to collect data and you'll be like, oh, I really can't tell. If I can't go that way, maybe let me collect sufficient data so that there will be an alternative, So that is wrong. You need to ensure that you collect only data that you need, and then you need to avoid leaking options. So what do I mean by leaking options? Okay, say for instance, you want to ask a question, we want to ask a question about location. Okay, so where is your business located in Leicester, for instance? And then you decide to provide all the areas that you know in Leicester. There should be an option for others because you really can't tell. There could be some other places in Leicester that you don't know that might be new as at the time that you're creating that questionnaire. Okay, so the idea is your questionnaire in terms of the option must be watertight, because if it's not, it creates some form of error. I mean, it's easier for you to manage something like this in qualitative analysis, but in quantitative, this is mathematical, so it is potentially going to create some form of error. Okay, and so when you look at this, you also need to begin to clarify and justify the kind of analysis that you want to do. I mean, so when we talk about quantitative analysis, they are broadly categorized into two: the descriptive statistics and then the inferential statistics. Descriptive is just providing generalized information about the data set. And I must say that for every type of quantitative analysis that you actually need to do some form of descriptive analysis, okay, because that gives you an idea of what that data looks like. As a matter of fact, you really can't adequately inspect your data. I mean, an inspection is the first thing that you need to do after collecting that data. You can inspect your data to be sure that they have the right, distribution without conducting some form of descriptive analysis. Okay. Then the inferential statistics reveal deeper insights from the data. For instance, now begin to tell you the correlation, begin to tell you the direction of that hypothesis, whether it's correct or not, and all that. And then there are tools that you can use. As a matter of fact, we've got so many tools right now out there in terms of analysis. You could use our SPSS strata. Again, you need to justify why you're using some of these tools and why you think that they are appropriate for that specific scenario. Okay, so this takes us to the fourth stage, which is about data collection, and that is the field work. All right, so you've got a number of qualitative tools that you could, so for instance, you could decide to administer a questionnaire online. You could administer it via email, you could administer it via phone conversation, or even face-to-face. Again, the situation and the scenario will determine why you're doing what you're doing. But in doing that, there are a few things that I think is important that you need to consider. And the fact is that you need to pilot. You need to pilot because it's not like quantitative research that you could quickly go back. You've got fewer number of people and you could go back to them. All right. If you administer wrong questionnaire, say for instance, you're administering to 300, 1,000, 2,000 people, okay, and you administer it wrongly, you've invested time, you've invested money, you've invested effort. So it's painful, to get to that end and find out that you've done something wrong. So you need to pilot, and check whether those constructs, the interpretation of the construct, the understanding of those constructs, makes sense and aligns with what you're trying to do. Okay. Again, ensure that you use appropriate method that aligns with the population. So if you're talking about older people, you need to know that perhaps maybe face-to-face will be better because they may not be tech savvy. If you are looking at young adults, you might consider maybe online. You can even decide to hire people, that will go out there and have a combination of online, telephone, and face-to-face. Just depends on how you want to do it. So again, you need to consider your ethics at this point. and innovate information sheet. So when I say innovate information sheet, is that, conventionally, when you want to administer a questionnaire or do this type of thing, you want to tell people why you're doing what you're doing and then get them to give their consent and all that. Sometimes this can actually be a pushback, okay, depends on the population or the target audience. So you need to be creative, because this might actually be a problem, before even starting. So you need to innovate. For some people, you might create a questionnaire in a way that the information sheet and all that might come at the end, but then they are still able to say whether they want to be part of it or you want to get up, withdraw, but then you need to innovate on how you do it. For some, you might even decide to change the name from information sheets to terms and conditions, just to ensure that you are speaking the language of the audience. So you also need to consider incentives, okay? Because incentives, it helps a lot too, whether you want to give them money or you want to give them hair time or something, depends again on the set of people. But the hallmark or the bottom line is that you need to be creative, in terms of how you fetch your data from the set of people you are looking at when you go to field. You need to be creative. There are a lot of things you could do, and then I think creativity, again, is about being responsive. So when you start and you begin to see how people are responding, you perhaps might need to change your strategy in a way that is not going to affect the original purpose, okay? But then you are free to also put this in the narrative as you write about the research. And then the fifth one is about data analysis. And I think when you have your data, the first thing, I hope I'm not getting bored right now. I just want to be sure. I've been speaking to myself for a long time. Are we still together?
Yes,
Hello?
sir. We are together.
Hello?
Together.
Are we still together?
Yes, sir.
We're still here, Adi, yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you. All right, so the first thing is about the data coding. Okay, so coding data means that you need to change it from, so this is an example of what I mean. So this is a raw data set, for instance, okay? So where you have, so we capture this online, and then you have all those Likert scale in there still the way they are. But you need to be able to transform them, code them into something like this before you can even inspect them properly, and then perform some form of descriptive analysis, okay? So the next is that you identify and state your assumption. Definitely, there will always be one or two assumptions or more assumptions about the qualitative data collection. And the next is you screen your data. It's important that you identify your assumption before screening your data, okay? Because your assumption, if you don't identify them, might allow you to screen out useful data, by the time you are screening or you are inspecting your data. So what do you look out for? You look out for outliers. And what are outliers? Things that naturally doesn't look like they conform with others, and there are a few of them. You look at normality. You've got the normal distribution curve, for each of those variables, okay? And you look at skewness and criticism. Again, you get this from your descriptive statistic. The normal range is for each of those variables should be between +2 and -2, okay? For exploratory factor analysis, you might need to do, as others, you might need to do sampling adequacy test. So the idea is that there's a minimum number of respondents, data sets that you're required to be able to carry out some of these analysis, okay? And so you need to do those sample adequacy tests, KMO or ballot test is some of them. These things are quite simple. You just need to know how to navigate some of those quantitative analysis too, to pick some of these things out. All right, they're just formulas. And then you need to look at the validity and reliability of your study. This is quite important. So in doing this, you consider the factor loading, the Comba alpha, and the AV, that is average variance extracted, composite reliability correlations, and the square root of half. So these are things that tells you how valid or how reliable those data sets are. An important thing is that you could do this validity test on a small chunk of data, and that's why I said pilot is important, so that you know whether you need to adjust some of your instruments just before you go to collect your data. Okay, so I'm just trying to use this diagram also again to provide description of the analytic area. Okay, so I've talked about descriptive statistics. Okay, that's again, it's like the outer shell of your data. Okay, that provide general information about the data set. For instance, your mean, your median, your mode, your standard deviation, and all that. They all mean certain things. They all tell you about the quality of the qualitative data, right? But inside that is where you now begin to go deep and look at inferential statistics. At doctoral level, okay, I will imagine that inferential statistics should focus on things like exploratory factor analysis. Okay, so this is a data-driven approach, which again is used to consider relationship between identified factors or variables. So in exploratory factor analysis, you don't really understand relationship, okay? So you run that algorithm, as it may, to be able to identify those factors, and also tells you the relationship, between those factors. And that is why we call them exploratory factor analysis, because they provide insight into that data domain, okay? For confirmatory factor analysis, it's just like having a, developing a framework, from a qualitative study, okay? But you want to confirm, you want to see how that framework, you want to test that framework with empirical data, okay? That is where you use stuff like confirmatory factor analysis, okay? So here, instead of letting data tell us the factor structure, we prepare and determine, so we have the factor, we have the structure already, okay? But we just want to test those hypotheses and relationship to know whether they are true or not, okay? But in here, in terms of the confirmatory factor analysis, there's something we call the structural equation modeling, okay, which is more like an approach to confirmation factor analysis, okay, which looks at determining the extent to which an already established theory about relationship among variable is supported by empirical data. So structural equation modeling, as far as I'm concerned, is just a type of confirmatory factor analysis. There are other inferential statistics, your chi-square, your ANOVA test, your t-test and all that, but these are just used for very simple relationship between variables. I'm not going to consider this rigorous enough for doctoral study, okay? And this takes us to perhaps the final bit, which is about contribution. So you remember that we started from the conceptual model, okay? And then from that conceptual model, we're able to get that data, fetch our data, develop the, what's it called now? The instrument. We're able to extract or collect data, and then, we now arrive at a data-driven model. So the idea is this is a theoretical model, more like a conceptual model, what we think, what we draw from literature, okay? But by the time we now test this with data, okay, this is the outcome. So you now have something like this, and each of these lines and those numbers, okay, they are factors that tells you the relationship, between those variable. And this is using a structural equation module, as you can see. All right. And then from here, you can now begin to see. So you see that all those variables, 7 variables that we talked about the last time, you find them here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, you know. And here we can now begin to test from here, what are the hypotheses, you know, some of them are not determined, some of them are true, some of them are false. All right. And so from here, you have your results, but your results is not a contribution yet. You know, a contribution answers the receptive question. So what does this study suggest in the context of my study? So you have your results. Yes, I agree. You know the relationship. Yes, I agree. But how do you now interpret them? You know, can this result be generalized? And then it means that you need to, again, dwell more on literature and also require some form of reflection and interpretation of the problem domain. And that is when you are actually making contribution. All right? So, taking us back to where we started, all right? We looked at creating quantitative research as a journey. And everything I've said, really, they are more like overview summary, you know, providing, perhaps describing the clothes that someone wears, you know, without describing the organs, you know, inside that person, all right? So I'll imagine that we can take this forward and look at other specific area of focus, like how do I develop the conceptual model? How do I develop data collection instrument? What are the fieldwork strategy? How do I conduct exploratory factor analysis? How do I conduct confirmatory factor analysis? How do I conduct equation modeling, structural equation modeling? And how do I interpret quantitative results? These are some of the things that I think we really need more detailed insights for us to look into. And so on this note, I want to say thank you very much, everyone, for listening. Thank you. You got questions now?